the clean energy transition is within reach if we collectively, the governments, the stakeholders really want. There is an unprecedented opportunity.
It's such a privilege and a pleasure to have our leaders in the audience, our distinguished panel, our panelists who are handpicked for those of the kind of think input they bring in and the rich experience that they bring in as well. And thank you to our distinguished audience for joining us. We've received over 200 registrations, 90% of whom are CEOs and CXOs. Many of them are repeat visitors as well, which is very encouraging and motivates us to provide higher levels of dialogue through online modes as well. For those of you who are new with us today, the Blue Circle is an exclusive ecosystem to help business leaders manage disruptive times and become future ready. We focus on 5 fundamental sectors, which are real estate, energy, electric vehicles, retail, and healthcare. We also present socio-economic insights which ultimately determine the evolving complexion of the market. Now, in response to the COVID challenge, the Blue Circle also has accentuated its digital presence. One of the many modes we employ is our weekly webinar series across these sectors, our digital publication which fuels these sectors with the right relevant content. And we're also building a hand-picked expert pool, which is drawn from our leadership community, from our member base, and from its associations, which will guide businesses during and post-COVID in these 5 sectors. And you would be happy to know that in addition to this, we will shortly be launching an exclusive digital platform for leaders, which will present them the opportunity of connecting with each other, also house quality curated content and meaningful conversations focused towards CEOs and CXOs. So those leaders who are interested, please feel free to write us for that. And today we have a dialogue between thought leaders. We have Global Energy Leader, Mr. Paolo Frankl, Head Renewable Energy Division, International Energy Association, Agency IEA, and Public Intellectual, Mr. Pavan Choudary, CEO of French multinational Vigon India, Chairman of Medical Technology Association of India, sits on several reputed boards, and is a best-selling author. Kindly note that we will have a Q&A towards the end of the session. Some of you have already sent in your questions previously, which are now with the moderator. And now I request Mr. Choudary to please begin the session, sir.
Thank you, Siddharth. And it's great to be here. Welcome, Paolo. I'm so happy to be hosting this discussion with you, Paolo, because IEA is really at the heart of the energy dialogue. And thank you for leaders joining in such numbers. We hope we'll make it worth your while. So coming to the topic straight away. Paolo, would you like to set the stage with where the renewable energy sector was pre-COVID? What were the main headwinds and tailwinds it was facing? Paolo.
Thank you. First of all, good afternoon to everybody. I'm really honored and pleased to do this dialogue. Now, setting the context, I would say in one sentence, making new records every year. So renewables in particular, and the power sector in particular, solar and wind, have been setting new records every year, rapidly transforming the power sector in many countries in the world, with 3 main changes: becoming more cleaner, first of all, of course, more digital, and more distributed. Now, 2019 was a record year in terms of new additions, and before the crisis, everything was set for 2020 to be another record year of all times in terms of new additions of renewable markets, and actually in all sectors. Now, with one caveat, The focus today is more solar and wind, so we will focus on this, but we should never forget that electricity is only 20% of total final energy consumption. So when we said at the end of 2019 that renewables were at that time 26% of total electricity generation in the world and growing 1% per year, which gives a measure of the disrupting change, we must never forget, however, that there is a total rest of other consumptions in industry, in buildings, in transport, which is not covered. So we have to think and remember that overall renewables, modern renewables, so excluding traditional uses of biomass, only represent 10 to 11% of the total consumption. So there is much more to be done, not just in the electricity sector, but in all end users of renewables. I would say this was the context pre-crisis.
And what do you think are the major headwinds this sector has faced? It is today giving a cleaner source of energy, which is very much required from the ecological perspective. It is giving today wind and solar the areas which we've decided to concentrate on. It is giving a more economical per unit price in most of the cases. Then what are the headwinds which this sector has faced, because of which this disruptive change could not acquire even higher magnitude?
You mean
Paolo,
before the COVID-19?
Before the COVID.
I would say definitely three main factors. One, and this is sometimes paradoxic, but it's very clear, policies. Because policies have, on one hand, supported massively renewables, in particular solar and wind, but at the same time, policy uncertainty, so sudden changes in incentives, sudden changes in policies are, to me, the number one enemy for investors everywhere in the world, because they change the rules very quickly. This is number one. Number two, for solar and wind in particular, the fact that solar and wind are variable means they need to be integrated in a cost-effective and a secure way in the grid. Now, this needs investment in flexibility, and that investment has not always occurred at the same pace of the actual or the possible evolution of wind and solar, because you asked, could they have not gone even faster? Yes, they could have, and they have not. The third is the cost and availability of financing, the whole point of investment risk. Think 1 second on Africa and how much potential renewables have in Africa. Africa today is only 2% of the total market of renewables. And how can it be that there is much more deployment of renewables in Germany than in Africa? Obviously, this is linked to the availability and the cost of financing, which in many cases has nothing to do with renewables themselves, but which is the main barrier. So these three main barriers, in my opinion, are the headwinds that renewables were facing already before COVID-19.
Great. So when you talk about the policy barrier and let me say a policy flip-flop, I'm happy to hear that this is a disease which not only India suffers from, but you speak about it in a global context. So Absolutely. It is almost a policy pandemic that this sector has witnessed. So the second point which you have made is the lack of synchronicity in investments in wind and solar, and these tying up together. And the third point is you have spoken about is even the lack of resource, the investment in resource generation, the mining, etc., which has also lagged. And there is one more point which I would like to bring in, Paolo, maybe at a later date, later stage, is the pressure from the incumbent, if any, and how it can be reduced so that It's so that the incumbent also sees that in this growth, his own footprint may also grow, though in a different direction. But I will come to that later.
Okay.
Let me ask you first that if you look at the position post-COVID, how has the renewables scene changed as far as minerals and supply chain is concerned? Because these are two Achilles heels, at least a large part of the thinkers feel that it is the Achilles heels of renewable sector. Has this heel started hurting more, or has it started becoming weaker? The minerals and the supply chain piece, Paolo.
I will come to the minerals and supply chain just in a minute, but I would say the renewables have faced, and to some extent are still facing, a triple challenge. The first is disruption in supply chains, as you just said, not necessarily linked to the availability of minerals, but in some cases that when this was, for instance, related to China, think about how concentrated the solar industry is with Chinese companies. This was the first country where the lockdown was there. The positive flip side of this is that China was the first to reopen, and then the supply chains came again on board. The wind sector, which has a more globalized supply chain, had more a puzzle of situations in this respect. The second is delays in construction. In many cases, there were projects going on and the people, the workers, had not the right anymore to go there to work. And this is also a big source, actually a bigger source of delay than the supply chain, which had another unintended effect that renewables companies are facing, that in many countries, 2020 was a deadline for incentives. And because of these delays, many projects have been risking, and some are still risking, to lose the incentives because they are delayed and they cannot deliver in time. The third point I like your expression, policy flip-flop. So policy uncertainty, which now has another uncertainty, which is the market uncertainty. The fact that demand is going down, that the prices are going down, and that these, of course, can delay investment from people that say, okay, but why should I, for instance, Brazil comes to my mind. They are stopping auctions because the demand has stopped. And they say, why should I invest in new renewables if my demand growth has stopped? So this is the triple challenge. On the specific questions on the materials and of the supply chain, there is one point which is important. Yes, the renewables depend more than the conventional technologies on some categories of materials, in particular rare materials. And there is a double issue here. One is the amount and availability in terms of really exponential growth of renewables. What does it, and not just renewables, by the way, also electric vehicles, batteries, and others. And what does it mean for the total reserves? The second is the geographical distribution. Who controls what? And these are two elements indeed that need to be taken into account. Now, right now, I would say the effects of this have been rather limited. In a longer perspective, and hoping that this deployment of renewables and electric vehicles and clean technologies in general will augment, this is something that has important energy security aspects to be considered.
Great point. So if I was to add to what you have already said regarding the three other challenges, and you very well perimetered the entire landscape of renewable energy, I would like to add that in the post-COVID era, the fact that the prices of fossil fuels went down so much, the attractiveness of the economy of the renewable sector became that much less. And I fully agree with what you're saying in terms of minerals. There is the vital need of products like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, where which batteries, storage batteries, are dependent on for better charging performance and energy density. Then there is copper, which is also not so widely distributed. Then, of course, the rare earths, which you specially mentioned, which were being used in the manufacture of not only wind turbine magnets, which are nowadays also manufactured just through iron and copper, but also photovoltaic cells, which require gallium and indium, etc. So that is the vital need. And you also mentioned that the new technology, the clean technology sector, requires often much more minerals than the conventional technology energy sector. For example, you mentioned EVs. A car requires 5 times the minerals of an ICE car. An EV car requires 5 times the minerals. An offshore wind plant requires 8 times the minerals of a common gas-fired plant. So the need is there. And the second point which you spoke of is the scarcity. That means they are not plentiful everywhere, particularly the rare earths. And the third point is the refining facilities of the rare earths. Maybe rare earths are available in several countries, but refining facilities are concentrated in one country, or that 1 or 2 countries own many of the rare earth mines. And the last point which you brought about was price. That the renewable energy, maybe the prices may be coming down because of technology, learning, and economies of scale, but minerals prices are going up. And also minerals, the way they are extracted, those ways may be unsafe or polluted and subject to social unrest. And the other point which you brought about was the investment cuts in the mineral sector, which is also applied here. So these are the challenges which we broadly face in the minerals and supply chain. Would you like to add anything else to this, Paolo?
I would. Let me, before that, say something that I forgot to mention before, which I think are 2 points. One, in the crisis, renewables proved to be more resilient than any other source of energy. I think this is an important point to remind. They were slowed down, but certainly not halted. In 2020, we expect new installations to be 13% less than in 2019, which is unprecedented in the last 2 decades. Since 20 years ago, renewables were simply growing year on year. Now, this is a little impact if we compare it to the collapse of demand of fossil fuels. This is one element that I wanted to add. And this has implication on prices, and maybe we'll return that when we discuss incumbents. Now, on the materials, I wish to make one point. Before joining the IA, I have worked 15 years in life cycle assessment and in a lot on material cycle. And the experience has been repeatedly showing that when there is a real issue of material availability, the innovation and the capability of humans to find other ways and other solutions is quite incredible. Now, if you didn't really mention, but if you look at the quantities of silver that were in the contacts of PV cells 20 years ago and now, there is a huge difference. And I've seen prototypes of solar cells based on nanotechnologies where the amount of precious metals is reduced by a factor 1 million. 1 million, not 10. So what I'm going to say here, this is one part. The second is recycling. One thing that the industry, both the electric vehicles, the renewables, and the clean energy industry has to have in mind, and they actually have, is that from the onset, we need to close the material cycle. It cannot be that you put a PV module in the middle of nowhere and then you let it there at the end of life. It will have to be recycled. And all the precious materials, metals, whatever, needs to be recycled. So these two lines, increasing the material productivity and recycling, will be the way to solve these important issues of materials and supply chains. But it's something that the industry needs to be very careful about.
Excellent point. In fact, you have made this point that that the quantity of a mineral which is used, and particularly when it is rare or expensive, it goes down as technology progresses. And I would also like to supplement that by saying that many a time the reservoirs of minerals which are estimated, they are on the very limited side. They have not imagined what new technologies will come
Yes.
in extracting those minerals. For example, copper. In 1950s, it was said that there is only 100 million tons of copper left in the world. But since then till now, we have mined 339 million tons because a new technology of mining copper came from oxides, and earlier it was only from sulfides. That is one point. The other point is that many a time, or once in a while, we have also run out of mineral. For example, we ran out of cryolite, which is used in, I think, cryolite or bauxite, which is used in aluminium. But aluminium continues to be made, and more better aluminium is coming because of technology. So not only the quantity will go down, there will be new minerals coming in. Photovoltaic cell, you mentioned very well. Now photovoltaic cells are using silicone instead of rare earths. So that's a great point. And the third point which you brought in was recycling. Recycling is a great point which you brought in, that all this has to be recaptured and reused. My only point was one regarding the resilience point which you made, Paolo. You have said that this sector has been more resilient than the other fossil fuel sector.
Yes.
But is this virtue not standing in the shadow of the point which you made earlier, that this sector is not so strong in the mobility side, and the pandemic has mostly hit the energy consumption which comes through mobility and increase the energy consumption which comes through electricity in the household sector? At least overall it has come down. So do you feel that it is the type of the pandemic which has hit us, because of which our renewable sector has come out more resilient, and not because of its, let me say, overarching superiority? Am I right, or correct me if I'm wrong?
No, you are putting a good element. Obviously, in the transport sector, so without giving too many numbers, but if we make a rank, air traffic collapsed. Bon, the role of renewables there is zero. It's just minor things. Traffic road went down very, very strongly, mostly for cars, less for trucks, of course. Now we see this demand going up rapidly as economic activity rebounds. So also their renewables little. The renewables slowdown was more in the electricity, but there is the resilience is anyway much stronger also in that sector. So for instance, in the electricity demand, also because of the market rules in wholesale market prices, fossil fuels went down in generation while the renewables continue to grow. So there was a counter tendency. So the gap was stronger. So in part is what you say, but in other part is the fact that the dynamics of markets is such that the renewables could continue to grow. Now, the next question, which then comes to the incumbent point, is what is coming next? Because one of the consequences of this is that there is reduced demand, more zero low cost marginal electricity coming in, the wholesale electricity prices go down. How do investors, in particular utilities, get the money from to make new investments in renewables themselves or in other things? This missing money problem, which was already an issue before, by the way, is now incredibly accelerated by the crisis. And
So
that's a real issue.
yeah, it's a good point. And which brings me to the next point, where I would like to discuss as to what is the typical response which you have seen from the conventional energy sector to the growth of the renewable energy sector. How is the incumbent looking at this new kid on the block? And what has been the approach so far, and what should be the approach tomorrow? That is one point I'd like to discuss. And the other is that where will we get the missing money from? One of the things which people say is that the subsidies should be re-examined. That the subsidies which are given, whether to the conventional sector or to the renewable sector, need to be re-examined. So let us first come to how has the incumbent behaved so far, and are there any other stances which he can take going forward?
So I would say 3 points. I would distinguish two types of incumbents: on the supply and more on the fossil fuel upstream part. And then I will come to your last point on the prices and who pays and on the subsidies. Now, the first distinction I would say is between those like discoms or like utilities that have an obligation to buy renewable electricity. And we have heard from all over the world utilities telling to the government, I'm sorry, I have no more money to pay the independent power producers. This is a huge risk for the renewable sector because it increases the uncertainty, it increases the cost of financing. It's something to take very, very seriously into account.
And why are they saying it?
Because their revenues are going down because of both decreased demand and decreased prices.
Price, yeah.
So it's a real problem. If you put yourself 1 second in their shoes, at least I would say the same. I'm sorry, I have a big problem here. Now, this is one part of the problem. The second is a different thing, is more in the upstream sector. And I would say the crisis has accelerated one trend that was already visible before, that for a number of reasons, the upstream sector is looking at diversification options in renewables in a very serious way. One, because the costs are going down. So for instance, for operations in the desert, it's much better to use photovoltaics than to burn the oil or the gas that you are producing. Second, because they can be under pressure from the investors on their accountability for carbon emissions. Anyway, I think the crisis has accelerated there a propension of the fossil fuel industry to look at more interest at the renewable sector to diversify the risk and also to decrease the costs. But the missing money problem remains, and the other things which remains is the following. I mean, the cost of PV and wind, we think, will continue to go down continue to go down. You mentioned the materials prices are going up. You're right. There could be disruptions here and there in some markets because of that. But tendentially, the prices are going down for different reasons. Look at the PV. There is an unprecedented gap between supply, between manufacturing capacity and demand, because the manufacturing capacity is still going up and the demand is going down this year. So this will go lower prices. However, the lower prices of renewables are not enough to shelter from the storm that on the other side, you have incredibly low prices of gas, for instance, and this gas tries to find an occupation, a consumption, and of the market, which even if all costs are going down, nobody invests anymore. That's the issue, which leads to the subsidies. Obviously, if the wholesale market prices are going down and the cost of renewables is constant, the subsidies go up. Now, the real question here is, you said, I would add, should we reconsider the right one for the 21st century? For a power system which is very different in terms of share of sources that have zero or low marginal cost versus the others. Because the market design that we have now, which has some incredibly positive features, was designed, however, in another era, in the 90s. And I think this is the real question that we collectively, I would say, both the renewables and the incumbents have to address together.
Yeah.
Generally, my point would be the challenges are so daunting that we need more collaboration. Making a wall against wall between the sector of renewables and the incumbents would not be a good way out for both.
I agree with you. Very well put. In fact, what you are saying is that the fossil fuel industry should also look at the promise of the renewables industry and try to venture, maybe first in a small way, into this sector to see what is it that it can gain and as well as bring to the sector. And they can take examples. Blockchain. Okay, let us see, for example, the aeroplane did not come from the aeronautics industry. It came from the bicycle industry, from Wright brothers. And the electric vehicle also we spoke about did not come from the incumbents. It came from Tesla, a non-player. So this teaches us that the challenge can come from a sector which displaces us completely. And that said, many of the new industries are learning from what they've seen happening in the aeroplane space or other spaces like the one which I spoke of. And blockchain as an industry which is likely to challenge the banks. The banks have gone and invested in the blockchain stream so as to know where the threat is coming from and also ride the threat to a greater opportunity. So that should be the mindset which makes a commercial business case for the conventional sector to enter the renewable sector. Plus, the governments can also play a role, like they did when they asked a DuPont, which was making chlorofluorocarbons, to participate in the process of making substitutes to chlorofluorocarbons. So one of your market is going to tank, but the emerging market will also give you gains, and you will not only be losing because of the shrinkage of this, but also because of the swelling of the new sector. So great points. And the second point which you made, I would like to add there, that you have said that minerals have gone up in prices. But I would also like to add instances of, for example, Indonesia banning nickel exports, which takes this out of the price game into the geopolitics game. And I'm glad that you mentioned gas, because gas also brings the whole geopolitics of it, which you may not be so comfortable to talk, and I will not seek a comment from you. But I would like to say that the proximity of Russia and China is because of the gas piece also. So all these things are changing the equations, and you are right, we should be looking at collaborations between companies, between sectors, to see how the renewable renewable brigade is not seen as an offensive towards us, but as seen as a momentum which is getting created, which can also carry our wagon further.
Let me just say one word on this. I will not get into the geopolitics, but I will only make one observation on gas, that the huge augmentation of LNG and the fact that LNG represents new routes for trades has enormously increased the security. Because the problem is always the concentration. If any material, mineral, fossil fuel is concentrated just with few actors, obviously, you mentioned now the nickel ban export from Indonesia, there are those risks. The more alternative routes you have, the better the world is placed in terms of security and prices and competition, of course. That's the only thing that I would like. So the market of gas today is very, very difficult, very, very different and much better than it was 10 years ago. On the other hand, this is a challenge for the competitors' renewables. That's clear.
Yes, and I like your point, because the gas piece also is the cleanest of the fossil fuels.
Yes,
it is the cleanest of the fossil fuels. Coming to security, will renewables alter the energy security paradigm? First of all, where do you see it right now after COVID? And will they alter it dramatically? Or what will be their impact on energy security? And also give us your comments on cyber security.
Okay. First on COVID. Given that the first impact of COVID has been a decrease in demand, there is not really an immediate security issue. It's the other way around. The problem is that we have too low prices and we don't know what to do with energy, with all forms of energy. The problem will come. So because, for instance, this point has been taken by some saying, oh, look, the crisis has enormously increased the share of variable renewables in the power systems, and the systems have not collapsed. Of course they have not, because there was all the flexibility still of the non-used conventional power plant. The problem will come if at the same time, and this is one of the three challenges of this renewables revolution in terms of security, we will have much higher shares of variable renewables. Now, this means the power system needs to be much more flexible. The flexibility has four main resources. It is either the flexibility of our power plants, and this is another positive feature of gas. The second is storage, which can do a lot, but is still expensive. The third is grids, which is very good, but needs 10 years to be built. And the fourth is demand-side response, which very often is the cheapest way, but has no market. That's the problem of flexibility. Now, this is, you asked me, will the paradigm shift? Yes, it will. The renewables will bring more diversification, which is always positive. For importing countries, it means reducing the import bills, which is also very important. But they will bring three challenges. One is this variability thing. The second is cybersecurity. because with a much more decentralized system, you have many, many more point of attacks for a cyber attack. I mean, I could I could tell an anecdote on this on PV inverters, because basically every inverter is a potential point of attack. And there was a story saying that you could call to the producer of this inverter, ask for the code, ask something like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have a problem. Could you please give me this code?" And then you are in the system of the whole network. And a cyber attacker can use this. So the sector, all this of course can be solved by technical and political issues, but needs to be taken much, much more serious than before. The third point is extreme weather events. Whether we like it or not, climate change has already started. Now, all types of energy sources are object of extreme events, so the fossil fuels as well, but also the renewables. Think 1 second about hydro and what drought can do. So there is a complete paradigm shift with positive sides and with negative sides on the electricity, on the security, in particular electricity security, which needs to take into account.
Great point. So I would only like to add that it's acknowledged that there are obstacles, but I think you and I are together when we say that obstacles should not be the reason to stop progress. And these obstacles have been there in almost every sector, even in the photovoltaic sector for maybe 15 years back. There were such obstacles of cost, which were seen as that time almost insurmountable, but the costs have then plummeted. So a great point. There are several questions also coming up. So let me just close this part of the discussion by asking you to tell us, you have just released this new report on sustainable recovery. Keeping that as the backdrop, whatever is the latest, can you throw light on how can renewables get stronger support from the governments, investors, and publics? And we'll be happy if you borrow the light from the report, but
Absolutely.
whatever is the latest.
I'll try to do it as fast as I can. This is a landmark report, in my opinion, because it gives the message that the clean energy transition is within reach if we collectively, the governments, the stakeholders really want. There is an unprecedented opportunity. Basically, it says that with an expenditure of $1 trillion per year in the next 3 years, you can reach 3 very important objectives. One, to save and create an enormous amount of jobs, estimated at 9 million jobs worldwide. Second, boost the economy, plus 1.1% of GDP, which becomes 1.3% for developing economies. This is an analysis that we have done together with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And third, last but certainly not least, to decrease emissions by 4.5 gigatons of CO2 and put 2019 forever as the year where emissions of CO2 world peaked in the world. We think this is a phenomenon, a unique opportunity. And the second point is that if you look at the numbers, I don't want to get too much in the details here, the solar and wind sector, together with the building and efficiency, are the sectors that can have the highest numbers of jobs per $1 million capex expenditure. It can create more than 1 million jobs per year. It is investment of opportunities in the range of almost $200 billion per year, and it would create a phenomenal acceleration of the deployment of solar and wind. These messages were just published yesterday. So it's, yes, I feel a phenomenal opportunity to share these few numbers with you. concluding on the policies, I would just say three things. On renewables, the policies need to do three main things, in my opinion. First, reassure the investors. This means reaffirm the long-term targets. It is not the time for governments to introduce more policy uncertainty. If there are auctions being scheduled, please give a long-term visibility to businesses. When will the auction happen? So that businesses can do sustainable pipeline of projects. Second, simplify. I said before, the COVID has exacerbated existing challenges. If you had problems of administrative permitting or grid integration, of off-taker risk, don't put more money to solve this. Rather, simplify regulation. And the third is support, as including renewables in economic recovery packages. These trillions of dollars that I just mentioned is only 10% of the announced recovery packages at the moment in the globe. So, of course, it's a huge amount of money, but if you compare it to the total, it's only a fraction. We think this can be done.
Great. So congratulations on this report. And I think right after it was released in Europe yesterday, it has been launched through this webinar today in India, and many neighboring countries, as well as people participating from outside. So most of the questions which have come to me personally, as well as on our chat, we have addressed. I will take two of them for you, and one final point for myself, which is addressed to me. So the two questions which I have from Surya Jidigunta and Payal Rastogi, and I'm reading it as they are. As the utilities are shying away from signing long-term PPAs, what is the way forward for solar developers to raise long-term money for renewables? First. And the second is related. How do you see the future of impact funds? And will there be any change in 2021 in renewable market? Any new markets or countries will you be looking at? So these are the two questions which I think can be clubbed by you and answered.
Sure. Sorry, my first, the second question I didn't get completely with the sound. So there's what is the future of?
Of impact funds, the impact funds.
Okay.
Will there be any changes in 2021? And will these impact funds head towards newer countries or markets?
Good, both very good points. On the first, we see indeed a worrying trend of not just utilities, but also the private market of not willing to sign PPAs, and which is understandable. And it's the perception of risk that is there. So you sign for a long-term PPA, but you don't know whether you will have enough demand. Or also the competition of other sources like ultra low gas prices. This is a serious issue. And this is why I think we are entering in a moment where the importance of governments is as important than ever. Now, not necessarily to give a lot of money, but to give certainty, to give guarantees. So for instance, the role of government can be indeed with guarantee funds, and then the rest of capital is private. But if there are targets, if there is a real intention to do these auctions, this needs to continue. This is the moment where the government and the policy signal is more important than ever. Because of course the private sector will follow the market in terms of risk and in terms of costs. This is number one. Now, the future of the impact funds. with impact funds, I guess you are speaking about these recovery packages that are done in the world. Now, it's a good question. Most of these impact funds are, of course, in advanced economies for the moment. The biggest, the hundred of billions or even trillion funds are in the States and in Europe and also in China. It will change the dynamics of the market in these economies for sure. We will have a plummet this year and then definitely a rebound of markets, for instance, in Europe or in the United States. Now, what needs to be considered very carefully, and we heard this kind of question also from Africa, is how are other countries not left behind? And in this respect, we are pushing a lot in advanced economies to make an extra effort to combine the recovery packages with development funds, with more collaboration between rich and less developed countries, because that's the other part of the equation. This is the moment where the risk of investment in less developed countries, which was already higher before, is now super high. And this is the priority for governments. And when I say that, I mean also the rich countries, to de-risk, to work together, to work with development banks at regional, at international level, and to pool resources in order to de-risk the investment in less developed countries. This is an important, I would say it's actually a vital condition for the success of this sustainable recovery, because it is the word sustainable has three parts in it. It's environmental, it's economic, but it's also social. And this transition needs to be just. It has to be distributed in a good way and not creating a bigger gap between the rich and the less rich. Thank you for these two excellent questions.
Yeah, very good answers also. And I'm glad you spoke about just transition and made that answer so very complete. So coming to the last point, which has come up in more than one question, that is regarding the policy flip-flop, that how we can, policy is the first enemy, how we can make better policies. So I'm reminded of Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was a chemist by training, and she was very thorough. And she got this moniker forensic, and she loved this moniker because her cases were very well worked out and watertight and thorough. Her head of policy research was a gentleman called Keith Joseph. He was selected only to look at unintended adverse consequences of policy measures. That was his only job. So we need leaders like that at the forefront. And we also need advisors who have good understanding of sector agnostic streams which are touching every sector today. What are those sector agnostic streams? Blockchain, IoT, AI, big data. These are touching every sector today. So the advisors need to have this. And when you come to a sector like energy, which has a commercial side, it has, let me say, momentum giving side to the nation, and it also has a geopolitical side. If you look at the history of energy, nation states were created for energy. When Winston Churchill realized around First World War that his ships will not be powered strongly enough by coal anymore, they will require oil, Iraq was created. and a kind of protectorate to make sure that that large nation will have oil. After the Second World War, when America realized that its oil drilling capacity will not be able to meet its demand, it created the protectorate, Saudi Arabia, where they have the central command also. And this has continued with Russia, today with China, in Sudan, Iran. So this is the geopolitical angle also which has to be understood. You cannot wish it away. We have to see areas of collaboration. We have to move constructively, but be aware of what the situation is. Then there are adjacencies. Energy sector itself is an intricate sector. Then there are adjacencies like electric vehicles, like major investors and funders. So those domain areas also should have the should be well understood by the advisors. So when such advisors and such leaders like Thatcher would meet, then we can expect good policy which endures and has no unintended consequences and no great unpredictability as we have seen in the past. This is where I'd like to end. There are more questions also. I will pass the mic now on to Siddharth. Thank you very much for so many of us staying with you and such fine questions. I hope Siddharth will find a way of addressing the balanced questions also to whoever they are addressed. Siddharth.
Absolutely, absolutely, sirs. Thank you very much. And what a dialogue this has been. Our leaders and I have taken home so many nuggets from today's conversation. I'm in fact still receiving positive messages. I was receiving it through the conversations as well. And while many of the questions have been answered, for those which have not been answered, I will surely come to you and take some of your time for the relevant questions. And thank you to our attendees for staying back in such large numbers. Whether you would like to engage with us through our expert panel or as learners, you're invited to connect with us for membership as well. We're soon launching our exclusive digital platform, and we will be sending out invitations to our select 1,000 members across these 5 sectors. So once again, thank you so much, sirs, for joining in. It's been an absolute privilege and an honor.
Well, thanks to you for this opportunity. It was a great pleasure.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Really enjoyed.